okay? Well, I at least had my morning coffee after spending a late night. I hope you all had your morning coffee and ready for this session. So welcome to today's session on assessing catastrophe and climate risk impact on insurance solvency. My name is Shweta Gupta, and I am the Cat Risk and Modeling Advisor within NAIC's Cat Modeling Center of Excellence. And I have with me my colleague, Ali Russo. She is the ERM advisor within NAIC's FRS team. So we're going to take you guys through a journey around how we are thinking about, catastrophe and climate risk. So we're going to talk first about what are the effects of physical and transition risk that are associated with net cat, perils, and the climate-related risks. And then we're going to talk about various tools that are available within the solvency framework to the financial regulators to monitor the solvency impact of these risks on the regulated entities. So those are the two main objectives of this session. So now let's talk about just cat and climate risk on a broader perspective, right? And what you see on this slide, I call it a natural disaster scorecard. We are still in 2024, so we don't have the scorecard yet for the 2024 season, but we do, looking back at 2023, and if you haven't heard in yesterday's session on severe convective storm, which is still called like a secondary peril, right? So this is the peril that took the headlines in 2023, and it is still the headline in 2024, because this peril alone has caused a cumulative, for last 10 years, a loss that is even more than hurricane losses, right? 10% higher, the trended loss, right? And 2024 is trending in the same direction as 2023, where we are seeing the elevated activity, last year it was $63 billion of loss. This year we are already at $50 billion of loss. So that's the headline. Now, well, we love reports, we love surveys. So here is a snapshot, a highlight from a report that was released by World Economic Forum earlier this year in January. So this basically tells that the environmental risk, they dominate the risk landscape, right? When it comes to extreme weather, so which is hurricanes, floods, wildfires, right? Or other changes to the broader economic ecosystem in our environment, which could lead to food and water shortage, or extinction of certain critical species, which can lead to biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. So there's a lot going on cat and climate risk space. Moving on, when we think about cat and climate risk, especially climate risk, right, it is not just physical risk, right? There are three categories: physical risk, transition risk, and liability risk. Now, when it comes to climate-related risks and their impacts, these risks are very complex, they are very volatile, right? And they have a broader impact on the society and the industries, right? Which leads to a systematic financial risk, right? So on the slide, you see that the physical risk, it's in two categories: event-driven, or called acute, or chronic, which is like long-term shifts that we see in our environment, which could be sea level rise, which could be the change in precipitation and change in temperature levels, right? And the transition risk, which is obviously when the society moves to net zero or a carbon neutral pathway, right? So there could be changes and the shifts in the policy, technology, consumer preferences can change as well. Now, when it comes to insurance companies, right, why does it matter, right? Because insurance companies are very large institutional investors, right? So they take that premium, they invest, right? So due to these cat and climate risk, on their balance sheet, they can see asset devaluation, right? Those assets can lose value, right? When it comes to on the liability side, which is also part of the balance sheet, right? They can have increased claims or increased volatility in the claims for the coverage they are providing for cat and climate related risk. And here we have a snapshot of what we have seen since 1992, and then just highlighting, in recent years we have seen dozens of insolvencies that are related to cat events like Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Ian, right? So a lot going on in that space. So that's why it's very important as regulators, think about that how this cat and climate risk can impact the balance sheet of the regulated entities. Now, I want to take a pause and spend a little bit more time on this particular slide, right? So I want to talk about what has been going for last 2 years, right? In terms of how we are thinking about the solvency related activities, right? So on the slide, you see that, well, our journey, Ellie and my journey, and then there's a lot of people involved in this journey, and it's still not over. It's still not over because we have a lot of work still to do, right? But if I look back, right, when I came at NAIC, after the establishment of CAT Modeling Center of Excellence, working with Ellie, working with the financial reporting team, Dan Daveline, Bruce Jensen, and our CIPR director, Jeff Skowski, it all started with the first activity in terms of what is the gap, or what we have already within the regulatory framework on the cat and climate data. What is our starting point, right? You can say that, right? And then, because NAIC, from a solvency perspective, they have these financial handbooks, right? How they need to be revised, it's a long and lengthy process, right? Because it goes through multiple iterations of approval and discussion and things like that, right? And then when we looked at, okay, this is the available data, this is what we have to do, and then what are the next steps in terms of what is the missing data that we need, right? So then the third activity is what should we do about data that we need to assess the solvency impact on the regulated entities. So how do we collect that data, right? And then obviously, this is a lot, right, that is changing. So we also need to think about what kind of training, support, resources, tools we can provide for the regulators, So that's kind of our journey, and now we're going to take you through this journey in few minutes. Although Ellie and I have been on this journey for for long, and it's still not over. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the existing data that exists, the regulatory filings that can provide the data that regulators can use for assessing the solvency. So there are 3 main tools that are currently available to the regulators, and that you see on the screen. So there is the NAIC's Climate Disclosure Survey. It is a public disclosure. It's mostly qualitative. It has been adopted by multiple states, and then, but it's only for entities that write more than 100 million premium within that particular state, right? Then there is ORSA, which is another tool that is available to the solvency regulators, So, but again, as Ali says, ORSA is for the big fish, right? So it's only for larger groups that are writing 1 billion or more in the premium, or like single entities that are writing 500 million or more premium. And obviously, ORSA is a framework, right? So there are different sections. Companies provide information how they are managing those kind of risk, so it could cover both physical and transition risk, right? And now when it comes to CAT and climate risk, within ORSA, it's only quantified if it is considered a material risk, right? Now, last but not the least, RBC. RBC is like ORSA, RBC is a confidential filing, right? And it has been adopted by all the DOIs, right? It applies to all insurance companies unless they are exempt, right? So this is the filing where we have some existing hard data, because there is the quantification, but based on the current view of risk. So not the forward-looking scenarios, right? But as many of you know, that NAIC just adopted in their summer national meeting, where we have now new RBC interrogatories, where companies will have to provide disclosure for the forward-looking scenarios as well, right? So, and Ali will talk more about that. So those are the 3 tools that are currently available, but we really need to think in a different way, because not all the information that we need for climate-related risk is there. Okay. So now, first let's look at the Climate Disclosure Survey. So it is a voluntary risk management tool for US regulators. It's not something new, because it was first adopted in 2010. So it kind of like provides a transparent framework where companies can disclose how they think about their climate-related risk. So it provides a baseline, what are the good practices for managing identifying such a risk. So as I said earlier, that it is adopted not by all states, but more than 25 participating states. And it's usually due, for a year, and it is due in the next year of August, right? So year end 2024 would be due in August of 2025, right? So there are about 1,700 companies, if we look at the year end 2022 reporting, that have filed this survey. Now, I want to take a few minutes and talk about what is the framework behind this climate disclosure survey, right? So if you haven't heard about TCFD, which is Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, this is a international framework that has been adopted by many global companies. It provides a tool, or like I call it a pathway to the insurance companies, that how they can think about this CAT and climate-related risk. So it has along these 4 main pillars, which is governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, and then there are 11 disclosures, that companies can provide along these 4 pillars. So that's the main framework of the Climate Disclosure Survey. Now, when we looked at some of the information, because remember, we are on activity 1, right? So we are looking at what is the data, right? Can we use that existing data within our solvency framework for future forward-looking scenarios, right? So what we did, we are as part of Center for Insurance Policy and Research, where CAT COE sits. So we did a analysis jointly with Society of Actuaries, which basically came in the form of a report where a sample of reports were read and analyzed in terms of what kind of information is disclosed in those surveys. So not surprisingly, there are significant differences by line of business, right? So when we talk about life, they are mainly focused on the asset side, how they are thinking about forward-looking scenarios from an asset perspective, which is the investments, right? When it comes to P&C, not a surprise, they more focus on the underwriting side, and then the health is more on the operational side in terms of what is the material impact to their operations, how they are managing their own CO2 emissions, right? So those are the wide variety of things we see through this analysis. Now, earlier this year, I presented to RAA, which is a cat risk management conference, in which I looked at it from a little bit different lens in terms of physical risk perspective and what companies are doing if they're doing any scenario analyses, right? When I talk about scenario analysis, it's really the forward-looking scenarios, right? So what I read from about 325 PNC unique reports, or samples, I selected 35 sample reports, right? And what I find is that 50% of the companies, they haven't disclosed anything, right? That if they are doing scenario analysis from a physical risk perspective or not, right? But 50% said something, right? And out of that 17, 8 of those reports had a specific information, which you see on the slide in terms of like what scenarios are being used, what are the perils companies are considering when they are looking, when they're doing their scenario analysis, and what's the time horizon, right? Now, earlier I talked about that in the RBC, we just adopted a new RBC interrogatory, which is based upon RCP 4.5, SSP2, and the time horizons we have selected for companies to disclose the forward-looking PML information, and we'll talk about PML later on. Is time horizon is 2040 and 2050. So, which is kind of like similar to what we see in my analysis, right? So that's on the scenario analysis, what we are seeing in the climate survey. Now, let's talk about ORSA, right? So insurance companies, they are in the business of taking on risk, right? So they take on different kind of risk, investment, market, credit, premium, reserving, and obviously CAT is one part of this, right? But within ORSA, companies only talk about CAT risk if it is considered a material risk to the company, right? So they provide so if it is a material risk, they provide quantification via disclosing the PMLs and, doing the stress test scenarios, right? And how they are managing and mitigation maybe by reinsurance, right? What is the impact to their current solvency position, right? But the time horizon for this whole framework is, I call it short term, right, or near term, right, 3 to 5 years, depending on the company, how company defines a short term, medium term, or a long term from their books perspective. So that's our ORSA, right? Now, in ORSA, the last bullet point which says is NAIC guidance manual, it doesn't provide any guidance, at present, how the climate risk should be disclosed or talked about within ORSA. So that's missing piece here, right? So then RBC, so RBC is the report where we have some existing baseline data when it comes to CAT risk, right? So because there is an associated catastrophe charge depending on how the companies disclose those numbers. So it's a formula-based approach, and most of the insurance companies, PNC writers have to file this interrogatory, RCAT interrogatory, unless they are exempt, and this is what you see on the screen, some guidance on which companies could be exempt. Here you see the format, what kind of information is disclosed in the RCAT interrogatory. So the companies report 4 thresholds of loss levels. We call it 1 in 50, 1 in 100, 1 in 250. Means if you want to know more about or what these numbers means, we have actually developed a CAT training for the regulators, how to read these numbers. But they disclose these numbers for hurricane, earthquake, severe convective storm will start from this year, and then the wildfire, right? So, but in our calculation, only hurricane and earthquake are used so far. So here is an example, where it provides a baseline, right? So the first set of number is what companies are disclosing for those baseline numbers, 4 thresholds, and then the second chart is basically what's their impact to the policyholder surplus. How their policyholder surplus will be reduced if such a loss happens or such a loss level happens, right? I already talked about it, which perils are covered, And now I'm going to hand over to Ellie.
Thank you. So we did a lot of analysis of the existing data, as Shavita has just described. Then we ask ourselves, we need to operationalize all this data. We need to make sure that this data is used by our regulators, and we need to tell them how this data can be used to identify risk of insolvencies coming from cat exposure and in a long-term climate exposure to climate risk. So we didn't wait to finalize our data analysis, identify the gaps, figure out how to collect the missing data, to start operationalizing this into the solvency monitoring framework of the Department of Insurance. We went ahead in 2022 and said, okay, let's go and change the handbooks. Let's tell the financial analysts and the financial examiners to use this data and how to use it. And this is a lengthy process, as Shavita said, because it goes through a number of approvals. So we got this done in December 2023. So these changes that I'm about to briefly describe are effective, guys, okay? So they apply to year-end 24 holding company analysis and year-end 24 exams and subsequent years, okay? Because when we amend the financial handbooks, analysis and exam, the thing is that those changes become effective immediately, okay? So at the end of December, at the end of 2023, basically, we got you ready to then go and use the data. And then we recognized that we need to develop some ad hoc training on how to use this data. One thing is just that, to create the procedures in the handbooks, but another thing is to show you how to do it. So we focused our efforts on the training. We piloted the training earlier this year in Miami, the Southeast Zone training, and we are in the process of rolling out nationally the training for all the changes to the handbooks for all departments of insurance. So this will come next year, and Shavita will talk as part of this presentation. After my slides, we'll talk about how this training looks like. So let's start talking about the changes to the examination handbook. For those that are financial examiners, you're very familiar with this slide. For the others, this is basically the structure of the financial examination handbook. It has several sections. It has repositories for each of the 9 buckets of risks that the regulators focus their attention on, and then a number of exhibits where they document the work they do, okay? How they investigate, they examine these risks. Because our financial analysis and our financial examination are risk-focused, okay? They've been for a few years. So then we said that the first thing we did, we said, okay, let's remind the examiners that there is data coming from the NAIC climate disclosure survey, from the ORSA, from the RBC filing, from the RCAT section, the PMLs that Shavita showed a few minutes ago, and let's tell them how to use them. And then recommend that they deep dive into the use of catastrophe models, because they are used to quantify the exposure to natural catastrophe. They used to produce these PMLs. So they should look at them. And then let's not forget that the exposure to natural catastrophe is mitigated through catastrophe reinsurance arrangements. Very complex. They should be looked at, okay? Next slide. Okay, thank you. So, and now I'm going to just talk very briefly about the changes to the repositories. We have every repository has an identified risk, and then it says this is the risk your examiner should investigate. The company may have in place this type of controls around this risk. These are the possible tests over these controls that you could do, and there may be another level of detailed testing that may be required. We introduced new identified risks for each of these 4 repositories, for investments, reinsurance assuming, reinsurance ceding, and underwriting. So I'll pick the first 2. I'll pick, for example, investment. Shavita mentioned right at the beginning of her presentation what is the impact of climate risk on the asset side of the balance sheet. The impact could be that some of the investments your insurer is making into, I call them the brown assets, in sectors that are very fossil fuel, can I never say this, fossil fuel heavy, they may lose value over time, okay? So what happens? The value of the assets goes down, the liabilities may go up, risk of, the capital shrinks, and may shrink to a point where you have a situation of insolvency. So we said, okay, examiners, you should look at the impact that climate risk may have on your insurance portfolio and on their investment strategy. On their insurance ceding, we mentioned that use of the CAT models. CAT models are used to quantify that CAT exposure, so it should be also, your company should use that output of the CAT models to decide the appropriate level of CAT insurance, right? Are they doing this? And then, we recommend that you sit down with your insurance company and get them to walk you through on how this output from the CAT model is being used to determine an appropriate level of reinsurance. On the underwriting side, again, the other side of the balance sheet, again, what's the impact to that insured losses over time, as a result of climate? Investigate that. The asset could be going down. The value of some assets may be going down. The value of those net CAT exposure may be going up. Are they setting appropriate risk limits using the output of the CAT models, and how? Okay, this is a very simplified version, but for the examiners in the room, please pick up the latest version of the handbook and familiarize yourself with all these new identified risks that we created in these repositories, and we'll train you on those. Then, I don't want to bore you to death because that gets very technical. We carried all this into Exhibit DD, the critical risks that you are going to examine. So we brought climate risk into the description of those critical risk categories. Next slide. And then, it gets carried into Exhibit V, which is the prospective risk, and we provide you an example, of how you can, we brought climate into the prospective identified risk, and then we give you examples of how you can document how this risk is being mitigated, and how you examined it, and so on, okay? So we did a lot of work on that. Familiarize yourself. It will make more sense. On the analysis side, we did the same thing. We said, let's go and make sure that all this data that already exists from the NAIC Climate Disclosure Service, RBC, ORSA, is used by the analyst. And there are additional sources of information, like SEC filings. Shavita mentioned the TCFD, so basically other climate disclosure surveys. And go and use them again to, as an analyst, in your risk repositories, pricing, underwriting, credit, market, and liquidity, to bring basically, to determine if the exposure to natural catastrophes today, but also tomorrow, because of climate risk, should change your branded risk assessment in the insurer profile summary or group profile summary. In other words, use all this data to decide, when you are scoring underwriting risk, when you are scoring credit risk, market and liquidity, if on your heat map, it moves, if there is a concern, and so that box needs to be watched. There may be a concern in the long term that because of Nat Cat or climate risk, you may have a risk of insolvency, okay? We also introduced specific procedures around these assets side. Let's go to the next slide. And you're probably thinking, but how do I know? I can pull out the investment of my insurer, but how do I know which asset may be impacted by climate risk? You don't need to do this determination. This determination has already been done for you. We created a tool. You can pull out, the investment of your companies, and we have already reclassified all the investments to identify which of these investments are climate affected, okay? And applied some stress factors based on some scenarios, and therefore we already determined the decrease to today's capital of your insurer. Okay, so it's a fancy spreadsheet in essence. Did we invent this methodology? Absolutely not. There's a lot of consensus has been created. First among the accountants, and then among the international regulators represented at the IIIS, the global NAIC, about which asset classes are affected by climate. Okay, and consensus was also created, so they were reclassified. They agreed on how to reclassify the assets to identify six sectors that are climate affected. And then a consensus was created on which scenarios, climate scenarios to pick, and therefore which factor to apply, okay? We'll train you on this. It's actually very fascinating, very interesting. Next slide. So we did all this work, okay? We have operationalized in the two handbooks. There is this data, use it, this is how you use it to identify risk of insolvencies. And then we went back to, the third activity, and we said, okay, what is missing here? And we identified two areas. We need more information about quantification of climate on those insured losses, and we need more information on this cat reinsurance agreement. So we went and decided to change, to use RBC, because of what Shavita said, that it's a confidential filing and applies to most P&C insurers unless exempt, so good place. I know this is not the primary purpose of RBC, but we chose that route for these reasons, and we created specific new interrogatories. Shavita talked about these new interrogatories in the cat section of RBC to collect where your filers are already providing those insured losses, those PMLs for different perils. Okay, so we needed to have a baseline, right, to understand the impact of climate. When you want to understand the impact of something, you need to start from identifying the baseline. Perfect, we have them. We have these PMLs. Next slide. Then we said, how will these insured losses look like in future? That's what we are trying to, that's the question we are trying to answer. So we chose a scenario. I'll talk in a second. We said, okay, we'll ask our filers, starting from next year, so from the RBC filing submitted by March 1st next year, to quantify these PMLs, but under this climate scenario, so that we can compare them to the baseline. So basically, we're going to collect the dark blue numbers and compare them to the light blue numbers. So compare the change in PMLs, but also compare then the impact of these climate condition PMLs to today's policyholder surplus, to see if we have a material loss of a potential material loss of surplus. That's all the idea, okay? No change in the RBC formula, but we are going to collect this information for the next 3 years. Next slide. So which scenario did we pick? First of all, we focused on two perils, hurricane and wildfires. Severe convective storms, as Shavita said, yes, major driver of insured losses for the last couple of years. However, the baseline will start to be collected from next year. So, let's focus on the baseline. And, but for hurricane and wildfires, we've had the PMLs for a few years. Now we're going to ask the companies to say, use today's portfolio, but assume it's 2040 or 2050, and the atmospheric temperature has risen by 2 centigrades. This is what RCP 4.5 and SSP 2, in simple words means. You have the same book of business, the same reinsurance, the catastrophe reinsurance agreement. How does that nat cat exposure, that PML, look like? Assuming today is 2040 and 2050. So how the insurance company can then quantify this impact? They have 3 choices, okay? They can go to their catastrophe models, the same, the risk, RMS, CoreLogic, KKC, and say, hey, have you already incorporated in your models the effect of climate? The answer is yes. Okay, then produce for me the revised PML for 2040 and 2050 for these 2 perils. Or they can go to their insurance broker and say, help me articulate my view of risk. And actually, after this session, Liberty Mutual and Munich Re that are in the room, raise your hands, guys. They're giving a terrific presentation on the own view of risk on the other side of the building for those that are in the room. Grab a coffee, go across, so you can see how these companies have articulated their own view of climate risk. Or the third one is a frequency adjustment that I'm not going to drill into, that was proposed by the trades. So they got these 3 options. As I said, we will collect these numbers for the next 3 years, and then as regulator evaluate if we are getting any value out of this, okay? Last comment I want to make is these cat reinsurance arrangements. So we talked to you and we said, okay, this is a main mitigation strategy, and we know that the cost of reinsurance is going up. And you've got some statistics here. In 2023, it was basically we saw the highest cost, compared to the average of the previous 17 years. And yes, now it's tempered off a little bit, but it's going to continue to be a significant cost for our insurance companies. How much do we understand on how these arrangements work? So you have quantified your nat cat exposure today. You're now going to quantify it in 2040 and 2050. And you got this cat insurance arrangement. Is it really an effective control over this risk. So we felt that we needed a bit more information. We created this interrogatory that is very descriptive, and we placed it in RBC. Next year, you will get it together with the climate condition PMLs. So a lot to take in, okay? A lot, I just want to stress this, guys. You know, we have been on this journey for the last 3 years, okay? And now all of a sudden we are going live, you know, climate changes to handbooks, you know, lots of data thrown at you, more data coming and thrown at you, you know, and like, woo, you know, my head is spinning. The answer to all this is Shavita Gupta. She's going to train you on exactly what you need and no more.
Thank you, Ali. That's fine.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, right? No pressure, right? Well, I'm actually feeling the pressure, Ali, now that you have disclosed this in front of, you know, so many audience, right? But what the main message, this is our last part, and we definitely want to leave some time for Q&A, for audience questions. This just basically provides that we're not making these changes because we like these changes, right? We want to develop a guidance, a training, tools and resources, how you can use this information. And with the establishment of CAT COE means this journey has already started, and we already have a lot in the pipeline that you guys can use that is available for you guys, right? So obviously the long-term vision is to develop a whole CAT curriculum, you know, which will consist of trainings, online modules, like things like that. And one of the module is already out there. We call it CAT 101. It's a beginner foundational level course in terms of what are these CAT models, how companies use them, and it's designed in a way that it's applicable for the regulators, right? Because these models are very complex, scientific, you know, you heard the presentation yesterday from Tom Phillip on, like, you know, what these CAT models are. So this is right now available in person and online version. In person means I can come to the department and I can do the training. I'm actually going to California CDI next week to do the training, and then obviously we in next step is to take it to the next level, which is the intermediate, right? So which is more focused on the peril, so not on the overall framework, which is CAT 101. So that's more peril specific. And the first peril that I picked is severe convective storm. I have actually drafted the whole content, and it has been given now to our training and education team to do the online version. And I actually want to thank Travis Gossel from, he provided really good feedback on the content which I have incorporated. So, I owe a lot of drinks to you. I think so. But then we continue on this journey, and then we're going to do the wildfire, hurricane, hopefully wildfire by end of this year, and, hurricane beginning of next year early. And then, as Ali mentioned, the more practical applications in terms of the changes that have been made to the analyst handbooks, the examiner handbooks, right, and this whole RCAT framework where we now have a new interrogatory in terms of the reinsurance and also the forward-looking climate scenarios.
And I think this concludes our presentation. Guys, the end game for us is not to create a dependency of, on the NAIC, on Shavita, but the end game for us is for you to fly solo. We want you to acquire the knowledge that you need. We are developing the tools. Jeff Sokalski, that heads the Center of Excellence, always calls it the regulatory toolbox. We got the disclosure, the NIC climate disclosure, the RBC, this and that. But at the end of the day, we want you to have the knowledge, the tools to fly solo, okay? To be able to have meaningful supervision of the cat exposure in your markets. We got 5 minutes. Wow, we made it. 3 years of work with an Italian that speaks too much, and Shavita is always perfect, but we made it. So questions, we got 5 minutes, and then go over and
view of risk
View
section.
of risk on the other side, and also the people online, okay? Questions? Everybody's terrified, or really, really unhappy with us right now. Kelly? So Kelly, for the people online, she's saying, what have you learned from the climate disclosure surveys in terms of how material this climate risk is? The ORSA is very silent on climate risk, but the ORSA has a very short-term horizon, and the RBC, until next year, we have nothing. And she said, can we, regulators and industry, work to make this information more meaningful? I think the problem is with the climate disclosure service is public disclosure. People do not want to disclose there, in a public filing what the impact is. They will disclose it to the regulators in a confidential filing, and I think this cannot be fixed. That is the limitation of a public disclosure. So, but I still see a lot of value in that, because there is in those disclosures, there may be no quantification of the climate condition PMLs, but it's definitely a lot of information on how climate risk is being embedded in the risk management framework of a company. And that is a dialogue that will continue. So yes, I see value and engagement in having this conversation using still using that disclosure. And I don't know if I got your question right, but. Oh, life, we did, yes, we did look at life and health. Health is more focused on the impact of creating a zero footprint, in their operations. And, bring your mug to work, don't use, plastic mugs, things like this, and more complex. Life is really the impact to the assets.
Yeah, and Jeff.
Yeah. So Jeff Sokalki is saying we are partnering with the SOA, the Society of Actuaries, yes, the focus of this presentation is on P&C, but yes, we haven't forgotten life and health. But, the immediate need was for the P&C industry. More questions? From Maine, Sandra. So the question is, Sandra from Maine is asking, how we're going to be able to, to compare companies when, in terms of their exposure to which three buckets? Sorry, Sandra.
Three options.
Oh, I see. Because of the three options in quantifying the climate condition PMLs. Take this.
Yeah. So Sandra, when I think about really the climate scenarios, right, and the climate itself, right, it's very complex, right? Means for the baseline, companies are already using different models, right? They are already using different models, right? Some companies may be using model as such, or some companies may have their own view of risk, right? Why? Because every company's, obviously there could be similarities between this is a large global writer versus this is a residential writer, right? Or a regional writer, right? So they're already using, they have a different DNA, that's how I call it, right? They already have a different DNA, right? So it kind of like translates in the same way to the climate scenarios as well.
Yes, and that was not, and to be honest with you, the comparison between companies hasn't been the main driver of all this. Was really to give you some hard data to have meaningful conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys, coffee.
More
and
coffee.
On all of your risk, you can ask all these questions to Liberty and Munich Re. Thank you.